Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another week here on The Wrong Idea. In case you're unfamiliar, being wrong is about embracing subjective experience over objective truth. We're not interested in being correct. We just want to explore our own insights and opinions. I'm Jack, here with my brother Lucas.
Hey,
I'm excited to get into this week's topic. Where are we taking it?
recently I've gotten a couple of people asking me about how easy it is to learn how to code. I am a software engineer in my day job, so I wanted to address this question. I know you've actually had some experience with this as well.
Oh, quite a few times. Yeah, I've taken after it in a couple of different languages. I've taken after it in HTML and Python were the two that I tried. I guess as we want to go into how easy it is to learn, I would say that as someone who has tried it a couple of times, it's not as easy as people will make it sound on the internet. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, this is a good point. There's a trend that I've seen in recent years where we want more software engineers in the industry. So we've been playing up how easy it is to get in. You've seen these things like advertisements on the internet that are for coding boot camps where they'll teach you how to become a software developer in like a few months.
Oh, absolutely. All the time. They still pop up on my YouTube feed.
So those I feel like misrepresent how easy it is to learn how to code, though I'm not going to go to the extent of trying to say you need to go to college for 4 years studying computer science because I don't think that that's necessary either. I'm a self-taught software developer and I was able to do a pretty good job of getting myself up to speed in much less time than a degree would have taken. But to be fair, I also did go to school for engineering in general.
It is true, you were trained in the way to think like an engineer, but the particular skills which come with software you did have to teach yourself, which are definitely different from the ones that come from just engineering in general.
Yeah, this is very true. More what I'm getting at is when you go to school for engineering, you learn to problem solve, to think critically in a different way than other disciplines. So that's definitely a big piece of what makes software interesting to me. It's less about writing in a particular language or trying to get syntax correct. It's much more about the broad concepts and thinking about how to solve these problems.
Right, yeah, and I think that's probably got to be one of the most valuable things you got out of the college degree. Engineering physics was the broader spanning topic, right?
Yeah, my major it was engineering physics, like applied physics with engineering application.
So just being able to think through problems that complex, right? Like we were saying, is probably one of the more important skills. So I want to ask, how do you think they like translated? How well did they directly translate?
So direct translation, that's a good way to put it, because I don't know that they translated directly, but more so that the mentality around how I approach breaking down a problem into its constituent pieces, what are the important factors to consider, and what are the different levers you could pull, that skill translates very well.
I think learning what to look at and learning how to use what you have at your disposal are incredibly difficult to master.
So I think a big piece of this too is just abstract thinking in general. This is a skill that I have found important in many aspects of work that I do, not even just in software, but I feel like I developed this by being interested more in math and having that translate kind of into the software realm.
Yeah, I mean, math is one of the most abstract thinking disciplines that you can get. I mean, literally, math, tell me if I'm wrong, was literally a theoretical practice to begin with, right?
Actually, I would argue the opposite. I would say that it was very practical at first, and only once we started to understand what we were doing did we formalize these procedures into more theoretical frameworks. So what I mean is you probably started with people using pebbles or whatever to just count that keep track of things. You're literally just trying to say how many of these do I have, and if you want to understand if I sell this many, how many am I going to have left? Am I going to have enough to sustain myself through whatever winter periods? And you're doing very simple calculations by just keeping track of numbers. And so it becomes much more about I'm using this for day to day work. And then eventually it becomes maybe as societies grew and you had to take care of more details, suddenly you have more complex computations to do. And so people needed to start formalizing the procedures that they were doing to keep track of simple things.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting way to think about it. And while we're on numbers, I think people generally think that a lot of coding is very numbery, very mathematical. How much of like just being good with numbers do you think has helped you with coding, not necessarily the thinking, but the being good with numbers part is what I'm getting at here.
Okay, so I'm going to make a distinction because being good with numbers to me feels like a very different skill than being good at math, which is a funny thing to say, but it comes to this idea of abstract thinking. Like, I actually don't think I'm that good with numbers. What I mean is like casual arithmetic. Sure, I'm fine, but I'm nothing special. Versus being able to understand more advanced mathematics and how to apply it to various disciplines. That's the abstract thinking part that I feel like I am actually good at. But to your question of how important is that in the realm of software development, in terms of your ability to do raw mathematics, chances are, depending on the area that you go into, the subdiscipline within software engineering, you're probably not going to have to do a ton of math. I mean, unless you're going into machine learning or you're implementing very low level algorithms that involve procedures that need to be very well defined, and realistically there someone has already defined the algorithm for you and you're just implementing it. So I would say that it's a helpful skill because it helps you learn how to reason and apply logic and form your concepts in well defined terms. But beyond that, you don't need to be good at math per se to be good at computer science or software development in general.
Well, I think that one of the things that's come up here is like the sense of that difference between being good with numbers and then being good at math. Did you ever think that there was a point in time when you recognized that distinction for you? Because I want to take this somewhere actually.
Okay, so there's one moment when I was younger that always stuck out to me in terms of my interest in math. And it was this idea that we have these operations that we do: addition, multiplication, subtraction, division. And my mind always went like, can I make up a new one? Like what's a new operation that doesn't exist yet, right? And I think that is the kind of question you ask when you're more interested in these abstract ideas. You're starting to go past the idea of numbers themselves and think about the operations on the numbers and how those work together.
Right. So where I wanted to take this is that I think that people get the idea that good software developers typically are only very good at being numbery people. But what I wanted to make the point of here is you could be incredibly good at abstract thinking and be just as good, if not better, than people who are just good with digits on a paper.
Well, going back to this idea of being self-taught, I think actually many of the developers that I've met who I'm most impressed with were self-taught. And that's only because I think when you have to teach yourself, you're finding that motivation, that internal motivation to get better at a subject, and you're purposely focusing on the things that you care about most. You're not being given a broad curriculum by someone else at university. You're not being given a very specialized curriculum at a boot camp. You're making your own, blazing your own trail, right?
Yeah. So I want to dive deeper into this. Do you think that because coding is a discipline where you can very much so do a lot of the teaching to yourself, that you can begin to refine a skill set which is better tailored to your strengths than you could if you were to maybe take it as a university degree?
Absolutely. Like 100%. I think that the more we can take our education into our own hands, the more we can tailor it to our particular interests, the better off we'll be. And I think actually the introduction of tools like AI to be more personalized helpers to teach you the things you need to know to be an expert in the room when you want to learn a very specific subject or a very specific tool or technique, anything, the more we get into, now I can very much focus on the stuff that matters to me and learn only what I need to know to solve the kinds of problems that I care about.
Right, yeah. And I think this is also really important because a lot of being, I think, good at things comes with having passion with the things that you want to do, right? So you won't be very good at the things that you're not motivated to do. So being able to not only do the things that you love, but getting really good at doing the things that you love just sort of like has like this butterfly effect where it sort of snowballs into this really powerful tool.
I think that, to your point, if you like the more mathematical side of things, which I do personally, when you're teaching yourself, you're going to end up more into that stuff. And so you can spend more time on it. But does that mean you have to? Absolutely not. If you're just not interested in that stuff, there's plenty of other ways to use your skills in software development. And plenty of people are not necessarily going to be very mathematically inclined or find it even interesting. So there's a range, and it depends on, like you said, your passion, what you care about doing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm going to shift this in a whole different direction here. because there's always something which is very interesting to me about this world, which you've mentioned to me so many times. And it's how the interviews work versus how the actual job works.
Yeah, this one is interesting too. What you'll find is that the way that software developers are interviewed focuses very heavily on the theoretical side of computer science versus on the job, you're going to be focused much more on the applied side of software development. So there's sort of a mismatch there in terms of what we're screening for versus what you actually need to do once you get the job.
So there's obviously those two different, the theoretical and the applied skills that you were talking about. I would believe that there is probably not a very direct correlation between the two. Do you think I'm right in saying that?
I'm not sure that I would make that broad of a statement.
More specifically, I would say that you don't necessarily need to have one to be good at the other and the other to be good at the other one, right? Like, just because you have one doesn't necessarily mean that you have the other.
Okay, I don't know that I actually agree with this. I think that it is actually a balance, and you do need to have a little bit of one to inform the other. We learn applied skills sometimes on their own, and then we formalize them into theory, or sometimes because we were exposed to theory, we will develop new applications that haven't been created before.
So, out of those two ways, which way do you like more personally? Do you like going from theoretical theorems to applied practices, or do you like going from applied practices and trying to formalize them into theories?
I would say, for me personally, I tend to live more in that abstract realm, so I'm probably going to fall more on the theoretical side. I like to see the theory and then figure out how it can be applied. But more and more, I see the advantages of getting good at certain skills and then only then starting to abstract over those to figure out what it is that they have in common.
Yeah, personally, I definitely would throw myself into that. I like to see the applied practices and then throw them into something more theoretical because as a racing driver, there is very little theoretical practices which actually hold very much weight on a racetrack. I remember one time my friend sent me this article about this technique called trail braking. Was this is essentially just you have a little bit of braking input into the corner so that it helps the car rotate. But this whole dude's argument was stupidly complex and didn't really have a thesis statement. It was kind of just, well, hypothetically in a lab, all of this stuff may or may not be true. But it's just like if you look at a brake trace from the greatest racing drivers of all time, all of them use this technique.
Right. And they got there, you're saying, based on their intuition.
Yeah, exactly. So for me, I've definitely taken a lot of real world things and put them more into ideas in my head, which I can sort of conceptualize and then transfer over and use in other facets of my life.
I think there's something to be said for seeing the results of things. People like to be able to actually see that what they're doing has some tangible result. And on the theoretical side, that's maybe harder. You don't get as instant of gratification. But for me, the satisfaction in theory comes more from the holistic understanding. I just like to understand how things work, rather than doing a bunch of really cool things. If I can understand, yes, all of these things could be done because you have this one very powerful tool. That to me, it brings a different level of excitement. But again, this is very much going to depend on your personal inclination.
Oh, absolutely. This is interesting because we very much so differ on this. I very much so like to try and learn something first and then learn the theory because I feel like I like to try and experiment with different things to see how my own techniques begin to work into whatever I'm learning. And then as I learn this theory behind it, I can apply the more nuanced techniques to fit my own techniques better and better.
Yeah, I think though you could almost figure out why this is the case just from the fact that you exist much more in the physical realm than I do, and I exist much more in the mental realm than you do. Like, what I mean is, I am visually impaired, so throughout my whole life, I haven't been able to do as many sports or other, activities that are easy to do when you have good vision. But I feel like you are out there at the gym and doing all these different sports and doing all these things, and like you are very hands-on, whereas I'm in my head.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. And I think it's very interesting. I was fascinated to see how both of our minds went through that nuanced way of, thinking. That was kind of cool. So One final thing that I would touch on is I, as someone who has tried to learn how to code many times, has hit roadblocks. What do you think are roadblocks that you see people hit later on in software development?
I think that depends very much on the area of software engineering you go into. Solving problems in web application development versus machine learning, they're going to be vastly different problems. So I don't know if we can generalize that much. But what I would say is that in my experience, as you get better and better at writing software, it's a lot more about learning good practices and principles for organizing your code and separating concerns appropriately. I think that people tend to have a hard time figuring out what those systems are going to look like when they first start writing software. And then you start to build intuition for systems design as you go. But that also comes from just wanting to your point, see things work. So people will often write a lot of software just prototyping it to get things to work and to try to see the thing do whatever it was that you intended. And only then, once you have the pieces kind of in place, do you start to organize them and collect them into reusable components.
So this makes me want to go down two sort of rabbit holes here. The first one I want to touch on is you said having good principles. To me, that makes me think a lot about having good fundamentals in the practice that you're in. And I definitely know that in literally every discipline, having good fundamentals is incredibly important. How important is it to have those good fundamentals?
So, fundamentals, as you know, I'm big on fundamentals first approaches to basically everything. So, I argue that fundamentals are critical. However, I want to make the point that you can be taught some of these fundamental ideas, but until you've put them into practice and seen why they're good things to do, it usually doesn't sink in the same way. So for me, knowing that those foundations exist and trying to understand them is good, but realistically, it's going to take some time working in these fields and actually coming up against different design patterns before you actually can appreciate what those principles are all about.
Yeah, that understanding versus internalization. And this leads me perfectly into what I wanted to talk about here because you also mentioned using these skills to be able to write good code in the sense of things that are logical to read and easy to understand and nice to navigate. And I think that you were talking about how building sort of that internalization for these things helps you write better code, right?
You touched on a couple of points there that I find particularly interesting. It's things about how maintainable the code is and how easy it is to navigate and to understand. I find that we're reading code a lot more than we're writing it. So that as a principle, just knowing that I want to write this in a way where when I come back to it in the future, it's easy for me to read or easy for someone else to understand, even if they didn't write it. Knowing how to do that is a skill that takes a while to build intuition for because you literally just have to work with other people and see how they interpret and understand code and what's easy for them versus easy for you because for everyone it's going to be different.
Right. Something that really stood out to me there was reading more than writing. You read the code more than you write it. And that makes a lot of sense. You also touched on the fact that you need to be able to write things and you need to learn how to be able to write things in ways that other people can understand. So it's interesting because you sort of have to find this balance between being able to communicate well with the computer, but then also being able to communicate well with other developers that maybe were working on the same project with you.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction because you need to be able to there are a number of different ways you could translate your ideas into code. And some of those are going to be optimized for the computer and some of them are going to be more optimized for human readability. And depending on what you're doing, you may choose one versus the other. Sometimes it may be a performance critical application. And regardless of the fact that this implementation is complicated and it's not the most readable or understandable, the performance benefit is so important that it's worth being kind of obscure.
Yeah. Have there been any instances when you can think of times that you have specifically taken that approach that, it's so good that I don't care if other people can't understand it?
It's not about it's so good that other people can't. It's more like, do we need this level of complexity to solve the problem? And if you do, then it's worth it. Everything in software I see as trade-offs. There's going to be benefits to some implementations over others, but then there's also going to be drawbacks. So it's a question of understanding your use case. What are you actually trying to do with your software? and then making the most appropriate trade-offs for that particular situation.
Yeah, I mean, I had a word pop into my head and you said it literally right there. It was use cases. It was figuring out what your use case is. And this has to be maybe one of the most important keys to development as a whole, right? Figuring out what your use case is.
Yeah, this is a bigger question than you might even suspect, because as developers, we have ideas about what we want the software to do. But ultimately, you have users who are going to be consuming the software. And they're really the ones who should be dictating how we use it, what it's used for. And so there's a balance that we have to come to where we need to learn more from our users. And then we also need to be able to explain to users what is and isn't possible in terms of the capabilities we make available to them.
One thing is, you said the user, and the user is different from the people who are having you build that application too, right? So how do you think even the people who are asking you to build it and the implementations they want fit into that sort of user realm?
This is a big topic because you have, like you said, the end users, and then you have the company that is trying to interpret what the users want and then relay that to the engineers to actually create. So you've introduced another layer of indirection here, which creates opportunities for more misaligned requirements. And requirements is something that in software you'll hear many developers complain about because the requirements weren't clear enough, or you gave me the requirements, I did what you asked, but then you're complaining that it doesn't behave the way you expected or something like that. Translating those requirements is a very difficult task, and I don't claim to always be the best at doing that. And I think that any developer there's always room to improve in these areas. So you need to learn to talk to the representatives of the users, if not the users themselves, and figure out, what do we understand about the user's mindset? What are they trying to accomplish? And how can we make that as easy for them as possible? And that process of figuring out what matters to the user, we do our best, but sometimes even then we get it wrong.
This brings up another interesting question for me. How much do the developers get feedback from the users directly to know what they want?
Depends on where you work and how accessible feedback is, like what kind of feedback mechanisms you give users. But unfortunately, I would say that a lot of times developers do get sort of cut off from direct user feedback. And we're often dealing with managers' interpretations or some other indirect method of receiving feedback. There are definitely places you can work where you will be able to see direct user feedback, talk to users who are actually using the application and figuring out what matters to them. So hopefully, if you're in a good role, you'll have a culture that promotes that kind of feedback loop, because I do think it's important, and you're more likely to get valuable software if you can tighten that feedback loop.
Interesting. Very cool. Well, before I round off this discussion, I want to touch back to use cases, because I think the use cases, like you said, are a very, very large and important topic within software development. But I think that use cases are just an important thing for life as a whole. Wouldn't you say?
I think I'd like to understand what you're trying to say better, but my interpretation is that having a good sense of what you're trying to accomplish, it's almost like goal setting. Is that maybe where you're going?
Precisely. I was going to take this to the place of knowing what you're trying to do and what you want to accomplish is incredibly important in getting where you want to go.
I think that that's very true. It's the ability to look into the future, understand where you'd like to be, and then crafting a path to get from where you are to where you want to be.
Love it. Well, this was a lot of fun. I enjoyed this. This was very cool for me to sort of get a little bit of a Q&A with you on the world of software development, which you go into every day.
Always a pleasure to chat. I had a great time.
Well, thank you guys for listening. If you guys want some more content from us before next week's episode, you can find us at The Wrong Idea on Instagram, TikTok, and X. Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next week.
Got a thought that challenges the norm? We want to hear it. Post your wrong idea with the hashtag #WrongIdea. That's RONG idea. And join the conversation. Who knows? Your perspective might just be featured in a future episode. Remember, in a world of endless perspectives, all ideas are wrong ideas. Until next time, keep thinking, keep challenging, and keep embracing the unconventional.